Hi, my name is Stanley, and this is Old Money Life, the show where we pull back the curtain on the dynasties, the fortunes, and the secrets that the world's most powerful families would very much prefer you never found out about. Today, I want to tell you about a family that has been convicted of serious crimes not once, not twice, but across 3 generations, and somehow every single time walked free. This is the story of the Lee family of Samsung, the most powerful dynasty you've probably never truly understood. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at your Samsung phone the same way again. The scale of Samsung, why this family actually runs a country. I'll be honest with you. I've been sitting on this story for 6 months because I wanted to make sure I got every detail right before sharing it with you. And the reason I was so careful is because the numbers involved are so staggering that every single time I tried to write this script, I would get to a certain statistic and just stop. Just sit there. And I would think, there is no way this is real. But it is. Let me set the scene for you. Samsung, the conglomerate, not just the phone brand you know, accounts for roughly 20% of South Korea's entire export economy. 20% of an entire nation. We are not talking about a big company. We are talking about something that functions, in many practical respects, more like a government than a corporation. I actually went down such a deep rabbit hole, researching this, that my wife had to physically take my laptop away from me at midnight, and I still wasn't done. Here's what I mean when I say Samsung is enormous. At its peak, the Samsung group of companies touched semiconductors, shipbuilding, construction, life insurance, hotels, theme parks, and of course, the consumer electronics that made the name famous across every continent on Earth. South Korea's capital Seoul is, in many neighborhoods, literally built by Samsung. The apartment blocks, the hospitals, the department stores. There is a phrase that South Koreans themselves use with a mixture of pride and unease. They call it the Samsung Republic. Think about that for a moment. A family business so large, so deeply woven into the infrastructure of a modern nation-state, that citizens have given it its own nickname that essentially equates it to the country itself. I personally think this is one of the most underrated facts in all of business history. When people talk about the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts, they talk about American dynasties that shaped an era. But the Lee family of Samsung did not just shape an era. At their peak, they practically were the economy. And yet, here is where the story gets truly extraordinary. The men who built and controlled this empire have been arrested, tried, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. Multiple times. And each time, something remarkable happened. Something that, honestly, once you see it, completely changes how you understood everything that came before it. But we'll get there. Let's start at the beginning. The founder, Lee Byung-chul, and the noodle empire that became a tech giant. I've been obsessed with origin stories since I was a kid. There's something about the moment before greatness, the quiet, unglamorous, almost embarrassing starting point that tells you everything about what a dynasty is actually made of. And the Samsung origin story is one of my all-time favorites. Because Samsung, the company that today manufactures the semiconductors inside your laptop, the screens inside your television, and the phone possibly sitting in your pocket right now, began as a noodle company. I am not joking. On the 1st of March, 1938, in the southern Korean city of Daegu, a 28-year-old man named Lee Byung-chul founded a small trading company. The company exported dried fish, vegetables, ebaum, and noodles to Manchuria and Beijing. The name he chose for this modest little enterprise was Samsung, which in Korean means 3 stars. He chose it because in Korean culture, the number 3 represents something great, numerous, and powerful, and stars represent eternity and being everlasting. I love this fact because it tells you everything about Lee Byung-chul before he had done anything worth noting. He was a noodle trader who named his company Eternal Greatness. The audacity of that. I genuinely admire it. Lee Byung-chul was born in 1910 into a moderately wealthy landowning family in South Gyeongsang Province. He attended Waseda University in Tokyo, though he never completed his degree, a detail that I find quietly hilarious, given what he would go on to build. And in the chaos of colonial Korea, Japanese occupation, liberation, and then the catastrophic Korean War that divided the peninsula, Lee Byung-chul did something that marks every truly great dynasty builder across history. He adapted, constantly, aggressively, without sentiment. After the Korean War ended in 1953, South Korea was one of the poorest nations on earth. The infrastructure was devastated, the economy was in ruins, and the government under Syngman Rhee and later Park Chung-hee was desperately trying to industrialize the nation at warp speed. And this is where the Lee family story takes its first significant turn, the turn that, in my view, planted the seed for everything that would follow, including all the scandals. Lee Byung-chul understood, with the clarity of a man who had survived Japanese occupation and a civil war, that in South Korea, the path to extraordinary wealth ran directly through the government. The state needed powerful companies to drive industrialization. Those companies needed government licenses, cheap loans, and favorable regulation. And so a system evolved, the chaebol system, in which massive family-controlled conglomerates and the South Korean government became so intertwined, so mutually dependent, that it became almost philosophically impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Samsung was the crown jewel of this system. By the 1960s and the 1970s, Samsung had expanded into insurance, retail, and textiles. By the 1970s, it moved into heavy industry and construction, and in 1969, Lee Byung-chul made perhaps the single most consequential decision of his life. He founded Samsung Electronics. The world, though it did not yet know it, had just changed. Most people gloss over this part of the story, but I think it is secretly the whole point of everything. Because the relationship Lee Byung-chul built with the South Korean government, that cozy, mutually beneficial, sometimes corrupt embrace between political power and corporate power, became the template that his son and his grandson would follow, with increasingly dramatic consequences. Lee Byung-chul died in November of 1987, leaving behind an empire, and he left it to his third son. A man who would prove to be one of the most remarkable, most controversial, and most consequential business figures of the 20th century. The inheritance, Lee Kun-hee, and the son who remade everything. This is the part where every single time I tell this story, I get goosebumps, and I've told it probably 100 times. Lee Kun-hee inherited Samsung in 1987. He was 45 years old. He had studied economics in Korea and business at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and by most accounts, he was a quiet, private, almost reclusive man. He was nothing like the fire-breathing industrial titan his father had been. And yet, in January of 1993, Lee Kun-hee gathered his senior executives and flew them to Frankfurt, Germany. What happened in that hotel conference room over the following days became known as the Frankfurt Declaration, and it is one of the most dramatic moments in corporate history. Lee Kun-hee told his executives, and I want you to really hear this, he told them that Samsung's products were second-rate, that they were being sold as discount items in American electronics stores, shoved in the back near the exits, that while Japanese brands like Sony and Panasonic occupied the prestigious front displays, Samsung was the brand that nobody really wanted. And then he said something that I've shown to friends who had zero interest in the topic, and every single one of them stopped scrolling. He said, "Change everything, except your wife and your children. Change everything." He meant it literally. Lee Kun-hee went back to South Korea and proceeded to conduct one of the most extraordinary corporate reinventions in history. He hired world-class designers. He pushed his engineers to build products that were not just functional, but beautiful. He personally oversaw quality control with an intensity that bordered, and I say this with genuine respect, on the theatrical. In one of the most famous episodes in Samsung corporate culture, he ordered a pile of defective mobile phones and fax machines to be stacked in a field in front of 2,000 Samsung workers. And then he had them burned, and then bulldozed. 2,000 workers watched 2 billion Korean won worth of products, roughly $150 million in today's money, go up in flames because the products were not good enough. I actually visited Seoul last year, and I spent an afternoon at the Samsung Innovation Museum. Standing there, looking at the timeline of products, from those early clunky televisions to the razor-thin OLED displays, I found myself genuinely moved by the sheer scale of what this man willed into existence. Whatever else you think about the Lee family, and by the time we get to the next few chapters, you will think quite a lot. The transformation Lee Kun-hee engineered was real. It was earned. It was one of the great industrial achievements of the modern era. By the 2000s, Samsung Electronics had overtaken Sony. By the 2010s, it was the world's largest manufacturer of smartphones, televisions, and memory chips. The little noodle company with the ambitious name was now genuinely one of the most valuable corporations in human history, and its chairman was a convicted criminal. The crimes begin: slush funds, bribery, and a convicted chairman. I printed out over 200 pages of research for this one story. My desk looked like a crime scene investigation board, and the section that took up the most was this one. Here is where I need you to pay close attention, because the pattern that emerges over the next few chapters is, in my personal opinion, the most damning indictment of a business dynasty that I have ever encountered. And I've spent years studying dynasties. In 1996, Lee Kun-hee was indicted for bribery. He had made illegal payments to former South Korean President Roh Tae-woo, payments totaling approximately 250 billion Korean won. He was convicted, he was sentenced, and then, 11 months later, he received a presidential pardon. 11 months. I'll be honest, when I first came across this, I was convinced it couldn't possibly be true. I had to go verify it myself. I spent 3 hours just on this single pardon, reading the justifications offered at the time, reading the political commentary, reading the economic arguments made by the South Korean government about why imprisoning the chairman of Samsung would be harmful to the national interest. And here is what gets me. Here is the thing that I find myself randomly thinking about at 2 a.m. It just refuses to leave me. The justification for the pardon was essentially this: Samsung is too important to South Korea for its chairman to be in prison. Read that again. The legal system of a democratic nation essentially said this man is too rich and too powerful to face the full consequences of his own crimes. Now, if you thought that was the end of it, I want you to sit down. In 2008, Lee Kun-hee was at it again. This time, the charges were tax evasion and breach of trust. Prosecutors found that he had maintained a massive secret slush fund worth approximately $4.5 billion held in the names of Samsung employees. $4.5 billion hidden in other people's names. He resigned as chairman. He was convicted. He was given a suspended sentence. And then, ahead of the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, because South Korea needed his help lobbying for the International Olympic Committee apparently, he received another presidential pardon. I actually called my mom after learning this because she had lived through this exact period in Korean history, and I wanted to know what ordinary Koreans felt about it at the time. And she said something that stuck with me. She said everyone knew. Everyone just felt there was nothing to be done about it. There is something about that resignation, that collective shrug of an entire nation that I can't quite put into words, which almost never happens to me. The succession crisis. Lee Jae-yong and the heir who couldn't wait. In May of 2014, Lee Kun-hee suffered a heart attack. He was rushed to hospital, where he would spend the remaining years of his life in a coma, never recovering consciousness until his death in October of 2020. And in the vacuum left by a patriarch lying unconscious in a hospital bed, his son Lee Jae-yong, known internationally as J.Y. Lee, began to make his move. Now, J.Y. Lee is an interesting figure. He studied history as an undergraduate at Seoul National University, then earned an MBA from Keio University in Japan, and began a doctorate at Harvard Business School, though he left without completing the degree. He had been working his way up through Samsung's ranks for years, but his father's incapacitation suddenly made the question of succession not a distant theoretical concern, but an urgent, immediate reality. The problem was structural. The Lee family's control over Samsung was not straightforward. It operated through a labyrinthine web of cross-shareholdings between Samsung Group companies, a deliberately complex ownership structure designed to allow the family to exert effective control over the entire conglomerate while actually owning a relatively small percentage of any individual company's shares. And in 2015, J.Y. Lee needed to consolidate that control before rivals or activist investors could exploit the uncertainty around his father's condition. So, Samsung engineered a merger. Specifically, a merger between two Samsung subsidiaries, Cheil Industries and Samsung C&T. This is the part of the story that I personally think is the most underrated because it gets overshadowed by the even more dramatic events that followed. But it matters enormously. The merger was structured in a way that was deeply favorable to the Lee family and deeply unfavorable to ordinary shareholders, particularly the U.S. hedge fund, Elliott Management, which held a significant stake in Samsung C&T and argued loudly and publicly that the merger terms significantly undervalued Samsung C&T. Elliott was right. Independent analyses agreed. But Samsung needed the deal to go through. And so Samsung's pension fund, the National Pension Service of South Korea, which managed the retirement savings of ordinary Korean workers, voted in favor of the merger. Even though it was financially damaging to the fund, even though it cost Korean pensioners money, it voted yes, apparently, because it was pressured to do so. This is the kind of thing that, once you see it, completely changes how you understood everything that came before it. The trial of the century, bribery, horses, and a disgraced president. Honestly, this next chapter is what made me fall in love with this story in the first place. Because it has everything. It has a president, it has a shaman, it has horses, and it ends, I promise you, exactly the way you are now dreading it will end. In 2016, South Korea was rocked by one of the most extraordinary political scandals in its history. President Park Geun-hye was accused of allowing her close friend Choi Soon-sil to exert extraordinary and entirely unofficial influence over government policy. And I mean extraordinary. Choi Soon-sil, who had no government position of any kind, was reportedly reviewing presidential speeches, influencing policy decisions, and using her access to the president to extract hundreds of millions of won in donations from South Korea's major chaebols to foundations she controlled. I went down such a deep rabbit hole on Choi Soon-sil that I genuinely lost an entire weekend. The details are baroque in their strangeness. Her father was a cult leader. She had previously been investigated for influence peddling. In one of the most surreal details of the whole scandal, a significant part of what Samsung allegedly gave her was funding for her daughter's equestrian training. Horses. Specifically, a horse named Vitana Fev, reportedly worth around $3 million, was at the center of the allegations against J.Y. Lee. The charge was that J.Y. Lee had paid bribes, in the form of donations to Choi Soon-sil's foundations and the equestrian training funds, in exchange for government support for that controversial Samsung merger. The one that benefited the Lee family at the expense of ordinary pension holders. I remember exactly where I was when I first read the full list of charges. I was sitting in a coffee shop in London, and I read the words aloud to myself, quietly, and the woman at the next table looked at me like I had lost my mind. I probably had a little. In February of 2017, J.Y. Lee was arrested. In August of 2017, he was convicted of bribery, embezzlement, and other charges. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. 5 years. Then, in February of 2018, after serving just 1 year, he was released on a suspended sentence by an appeals court that partially overturned the conviction. In 2021, a retrial resulted in a new conviction and a 2.5-year prison sentence. He returned to prison. And then, in August of 2022, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol issued, say it with me now, a special pardon. 3 generations of the Lee family, 3 generations of criminal convictions, 3 generations of presidential pardons. I have been sitting with this fact for 6 months, and I still cannot fully process it. There is something about this that I cannot quite put into words, which almost never happens to me. The pattern, a dynasty that literally cannot stop committing crimes. Here is my honest personal opinion, and I want you to know that I do not say this lightly. I have studied old money families for years. I have covered the Vanderbilts, the Onassis dynasty, and the Grosvenors of London. I have looked at dynasties that were ruthless, dynasties that were cruel, dynasties that played fast and loose with the rules. But the Lee family of Samsung represents something that I think is categorically different. It is this: the crimes are not aberrations. They are not the result of one bad actor in an otherwise honorable lineage. They are a system. They are a feature, not a bug, of how this dynasty operates. Lee Byung-chul built the original corrupt relationship between Samsung and the South Korean state. The relationship that gave Samsung preferential treatment, cheap government loans, and protected market positions in exchange for the conglomerate acting as an engine of national development. He understood from the very beginning that in the world he inhabited, power was not purely economic. It was political, and it was maintained through transactions that did not appear in any official ledger. Lee Kun-hee inherited that understanding and, if anything, deepened it. His slush funds, his secret accounts, his payments to presidents. These were not reckless impulses. They were the continuation of a playbook. And Lee Jae-yong, J.Y. Lee, inherited the playbook in turn. His alleged payments to Choi Soon-sil, his maneuvering around the pension fund merger. These actions bear the unmistakable fingerprints of a man who had watched his father and grandfather operate for decades and had learned that the rules of the game were not what was written in the law books, but what was understood between powerful men in private rooms. This is a topic I avoided writing about for a long time because, truthfully, it made me uncomfortable. Not because the Lee family makes me uncomfortable, though they certainly should, but because the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story is not really about one family. It is about what happens when a corporation becomes so systemically important to a nation that the nation loses the ability to hold it accountable. When the implicit bargain becomes, we will look the other way because we cannot afford not to. Samsung makes components that go into Apple products. Samsung's semiconductors are inside devices made by companies all over the world. The global technology supply chain runs, in significant part, through facilities controlled by a family whose patriarch was convicted multiple times and who was pardoned by a president whose successor was herself arrested and imprisoned for, among other things, allegedly taking bribes from that same family. I have interviewed experts in corporate governance, in Korean political economy, and in comparative business history. Not a single one of them could fully explain to me how this cycle perpetuates itself without sounding, at some point, almost resigned. As if the situation is simply the situation, as if Samsung is simply too embedded in too many things for accountability to be more than a periodic interruption before business as usual resumes. That resignation, that is the thing I find most troubling of all. the legacy. Should we admire them or lock them up? And so, here we are. The Lee family of Samsung is worth, at the time I am writing this script, somewhere in the region of 370 billion US dollars when you account for the full value of the conglomerate they control. That is a number so large that if you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you over 1,000 years to spend it all. And I find myself, as I always do at the end of these stories, sitting with a contradiction. Because here is what is also true. Samsung, under the Lee family, transformed to South Korea from a war-devastated developing nation into one of the most technologically advanced economies on Earth. The screens you read on, the chips that power your devices, the home appliances in your kitchen, the Lee family's obsessive, relentless, visionary drive touched all of it. Lee Kun-hee standing in that German hotel room in 1993, telling his executives to change everything, produced real and genuinely valuable things that are part of billions of people's daily lives. I actually spent a long time thinking about how to end this script. I went back and forth on it. I wanted to be fair without being soft. I wanted to be honest without being reductive. And here is where I landed. In every other story I have covered on this channel, the Vanderbilts, the Onassis family, the Grosvenors, the central question is ultimately about the relationship between extraordinary wealth and human happiness. About whether money insulates you from consequence, or simply changes the nature of the consequences you face. The Lee family story asks a harder question. It asks whether a dynasty can be simultaneously one of the greatest engines of human technological progress in the modern era and a criminal enterprise that has systematically corrupted the political institutions of a democratic nation across 3 generations. The answer, based on the evidence, appears to be yes. You can do both. You can build things that genuinely matter, and you can do it through methods that are genuinely indefensible. You can stand in a field and burn defective phones in front of 2,000 employees because your standards are that high, and you can maintain a $4.5 billion secret slush fund because your ethics are that low. I have never told anyone this, but the first time I read the full sweep of this story, from the Noodle Company in 1938, all the way to the horse bribery scandal in 2017, I actually had to put my notes down and just sit with it for a minute. Because it is a story about what greatness actually costs. Not to the people who build it, but to everyone else. Samsung will outlast this conversation. The Lee family will, almost certainly, continue to control it. J.Y. Lee, free on his presidential pardon, continues to lead the company. The factories are running. The semiconductors are being manufactured. Your phone, quite possibly, has their fingerprints on it. And the 3 stars still burn. Whether they illuminate or whether they blind depends entirely on where you are standing. My name is Stanley. This has been Old Money Life. And as always, thank you for being here.